Chapter 12 of The Sorcery Club by Elliott O'Donnell. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 12 The Great Challenge. When John Martin came in to tea that afternoon, he gave Gladys a shock. Despite the fact that he had been in the sun all day and was much tanned in consequence, he had never looked, so Gladys thought, so old and haggard. "You dear old daddy," she said, hastening to pour him out some tea. "You shouldn't work so hard. This silly digging has quite knocked you up. Haven't you finished?"
"Yes, I've finished," John Martin said, catching his breath. "I found water."
"Nonsense."
"It's true all the same. We struck it at exactly the distance he said 20 feet."
"Then of course he knew."
"How? How in the deuce could he have known?"
"I can't say," Gladys replied. "All I know is that he's not straight, and that there's some underhand trickery going on. But do have your tea now and dismiss it from your mind. Anyhow, he can do you no harm."
"Here's a letter for you, John," Mrs. Templeton exclaimed, entering the room at that moment.
John Martin took it from her and tore open the envelope curiously. It was a handwriting he did not know, and did not like. Its characteristics were sinister.
"I knew it!" he cried. "I knew the fellow was a scoundrel. What the deuce do you think he has the impertinence to do now?"
"He?" Gladys said, looking anxiously at her father. "Whoever do you mean?"
"Why, that confounded young bounder who came here last night Leon Hamar, he signs himself. In this letter he declares that he can perform any of our tricks, and will accept the wager I offered for their solution some little time ago. He also says that unless I consent to see him, and to listen courteously to what he has to say, he will publicly announce his intention of taking up the wager, at our hall, in Kingsway, to night."
"Do you think there's any possibility of his having discovered the secrets of your tricks?" Gladys asked. "Could he have bribed anyone to tell him?"
"I don't think so," John Martin said. "The only people who have any clue as to how they are done are my two attendants, both, as you know, natives of Cashmere, and men who, I feel pretty certain, could not be got at."
"In that case," Gladys remarked, "I fail to see what there is to worry about. Your course is perfectly clear. Take no notice of it." John Martin was silent, dazed. He did not know what to think or do. There was something painfully ominous to him in the discovery of the money and the water, something that accentuated the impression Hamar's sinister experience had made on him. The man did not look ordinary. His manner, gestures, walk and expression were decidedly abnormal. In fact, they put him in mind of the superphysical. The superphysical! Might not that account for his knowledge? Bah! There was no such thing as the superphysical. The man was extraordinary, but after all only a man; his knowledge only that of a man. And it must be as the shrewd Gladys conjectured. He had put the money in the tree himself, and had learned the presence of water through some subtle artifice perhaps only guessed at it. He would defy him, let him do what he would. This was John Martin's decision as he finished tea. An hour later he had changed his mind and was speaking to Hamar on the telephone, expressing his willingness to grant him a brief interview if he came at once. In rather less than an hour a motor drew up at the Martins' door, and Hamar stepped out of it. "Glad to find you in a more tractable mood, Mr. Martin," he exclaimed on being ushered into the latter's presence. "I reckoned you would sing to a different tune when you found that water. Would you like me to give you a few more samples of my skill before we proceed to business?"
"Name your business at once," John Martin replied gruffly. "I haven't many minutes to spare."
"No," Hamar said. "That's a pity, because part of what I have at the back of my brain may take more than a few minutes arranging. The situation in a nutshell is this. You have a pretty daughter, Mr. Martin."
"How dare you, sir!" John Martin broke in, clenching his fist.
"Gently, gently, Mr. Martin," Hamar observed, backing towards the door. "Gently. You promised to give me a courteous hearing. I meant no offence. I say I admire your daughter immensely. She takes the shine out of our American girls."
"The deuce she does!" John Martin foamed.
"She does, you bet," Hamar went on.
and I see no reason, if she likes me, why we couldn't get engaged. I would do the thing handsomely as far as money goes. What do you say?" "I say that unless you're very careful I shall break my promise and kick you." "I would pay you a big lump sum to take me into partnership," Hamar went on complacently, "and I would introduce a number of new tricks that would stagger creation. I shouldn't be in any hurry to marry. The length of the engagement would be for you to decide." "Then it would be ad infinitum," John Martin said grimly, "for you'll never get my consent to a marriage." "Never is a long day, and even a John Martin may change. You want new blood and new capital in your firm. You would have both in me. I assure you your show would boom as it has never boomed before." "And the only condition on which you offer me all this is my daughter?" "You have said it. That is the one and only condition. Your daughter, my brains, my dollars." "I have decided," John Martin said. "Good!" Hamar exclaimed. "I guessed you would. There's nothing like the almighty dollar, is there?" "Yes," John Martin rejoined, "the almighty fist, and that's what you'll get if you don't clear out of this house instantly. And if you ever come skulking round here again, or write me any more letters, I'll set my solicitor on to you." "Then it's war war to the knife," Hamar sneered. "How melodramatic. But it won't last long. I shall yet be your partner, and I shall yet have Miss Gladys. Au revoir. I won't say good bye." And with a mock bow he hurriedly took his departure. That night Messrs. Martin and Davenport's entertainment had progressed as usual for about half an hour, when it suddenly came to a full stop. A man in the lowest tier of boxes had risen and was addressing the audience in a loud voice. "Ladies and gentlemen." In an instant all heads swung round, and there were stentorian shouts of silence. But Curtis, for it was he, was not easily daunted. "Do you call this fair play?" he demanded. "I am here to night to make a sporting offer, and one which will afford you vast entertainment." Cries of "Shut up!" "Silence!" "He's drunk!" "Turn him out!" merging into one loud roar, forced him to pause. Several uniformed officials now invaded the box, but Hamar, who as well as Kelson was with Curtis, fixing them with his big dark eyes that gleamed eerily in the half lowered lights of the house, for the stage only at that moment was fully illuminated, held them in check, and they hung back not knowing what to do. This move of Hamar's took with a large section of the audience, some of whom were possessed with sporting instincts, whilst others were merely curious, and the somewhat premature cries of "Turn him out!" etc., were soon lost in vociferous shouts of "Let them alone!" "Let them speak!" "Let us hear what they have to say!" It was in the midst of this hubbub that John Martin, in a great state of nervous agitation, came to the front of the stage and inquired the cause of the commotion. The shouting still continued, and Gladys, who had come to the performance, anticipating something of the sort, called to her father from the wings, bidding him give Curtis permission to speak. "You will lose all sympathy if you don't, father," she added, "and besides, you have nothing to fear. It's sheer bravado and impudence on their part." Thus advised, for Gladys was a level headed girl, John Martin gave in, and the audience showed their approval by a vigorous round of clapping. "I wish I were spokesman," Kelson said, his eyes glistening at the sight of so many pretty upturned faces. "Go on, old man," he said, giving Curtis a nudge. "Fire away, and show them you know a bit about elocution, for the credit of the firm." Curtis needed no encouragement. What little bashfulness he had once possessed, he had certainly left behind in San Francisco, for he leaned over the front of the box and smiled familiarly at the audience. "I am Edward Curtis," he said, "one of the directors of the Modern Sorcery Company Limited. Messrs. Martin and Davenport have so often boasted that no one outside of their firm can perform their tricks, that I have come here to night resolved to disillusion them. I not only accept their offer of £10,000 for the solution of their tricks, but I agree to pay them double that amount, cash down, if I do not do everything they do, from the brass coffin to their world famed pumpkin puzzle. With Messrs. Martin and Davenport's permission, I will explain one and all of their tricks to you to night. And the only thing I ask of you, ladies and gentlemen, is to see that I get fair play." A spontaneous outburst of clapping followed his speech, and as soon as it had ceased, one of the audience, who had risen and was waiting to speak, said "I trust Messrs. Martin and Davenport will accept this challenge, and allow the Modern Sorcery Company the opportunity here in this hall to night of displaying their skill, or their ignorance, as the case may be. If Messrs. Martin and Davenport's tricks cannot be performed by any outsider, the Firm, in accepting this challenge, will be £20,000 the richer; and if, as is hardly likely, Messrs. Martin and Davenport should be outwitted, I am sure they themselves will be amongst the first to congratulate their successful rivals. I, for one, am quite ready to act as referee." "I, too," shouted a dozen other voices. "Be a sport and accept his bet." "Ladies and gentlemen," John Martin replied with dignity, "you have given me no alternative. I accept the challenge. Perhaps those who have so kindly volunteered to act as referees will see that order is maintained, whilst I go on with my performance, at the conclusion of which Mr. Curtis I think that is the name of my rival will be quite at liberty to try his exposition of my tricks." The performance then proceeded, and when it was over, Curtis, Hamar and Kelson, accompanied by 6 of those of the audience who had volunteered to act as referees, stepped on to the stage. Seats were provided for the referees, 3 on one side of the stage and 3 on the other, and having seen that everything was fair and square, John Martin retired to the O.P. wing, behind which Gladys was concealed. A brief description of the brass coffin trick, which was the first Messrs. Hamar, Curtis and Kelson proceeded to explain, will perhaps suffice. A massively constructed brass bound coffin is handed round to the audience, who carefully examine it, and being unable to discover anything amiss, pronounce themselves satisfied that it is genuine. The operator then summons an assistant, jokingly refers to him as the corpse, puts him into a sack made to represent a winding sheet, securely binds the sack with a piece of cord, and asks one of the audience to seal it. The sack and its contents are then placed in the coffin, which is locked and corded. The operator then throws a sheet over the coffin, lets it remain there for a few seconds, and on removing it and opening the lid, the coffin is found to be empty. A shout from the front of the house makes everyone turn round, when, to their amazement, the corpse is seen standing up at the back of the pit, holding the sack with the rope and seal intact in his hand. Such was the marvellous feat which had been accomplished in Martin and Davenport's hall, night in and night out for years, the solution of which no one as yet had been able to discover. One can imagine, in these circumstances, the tremendous excitement of the audience at the prospect of seeing this notorious puzzle tackled, and tackled by a member of a firm which was already reputed to be doing all kinds of weird and extraordinary things. But whereas it was quite obvious that John Martin was greatly perturbed, his eyebrows were working nervously and his lips and fingers twitching, Curtis, on the other hand, was as cool as possible. He literally did not turn a hair. "Now, gentlemen," he said, turning to the referees, "keep your eyes well skinned and observe everything I do. Ladies and gentlemen," he went on, raising his voice, "I am now about to show you how the coffin trick is done. Observe me. I'm the corpse. Mr. Kelson here is the operator." And Matt Kelson, rather to Hamar's annoyance, advanced down the stage to take part in the proceedings. "Watch me get into the sack." He stepped into it as he spoke. "Look at what I have in my hand," he went on, holding up his right hand in full view of the audience. "I have a plug of wood covered with the same material as this sack. As soon as I stoop down and the sack is pulled over me, I shall thrust this plug into the mouth of it, and Mr. Kelson will bind the sack round it. I shall then be put into the coffin. You think you know this coffin, but you don't. See," and stepping out of the sack, he tapped the head of the coffin, which was very broad and deep. "Come closer," and he beckoned to the referees, whose numbers were now augmented by 3 newspaper reporters, representatives of the Daily Snapper, the Planet, and the Hooter, respectively. "Here is a secret panel worked by a spring. I will press and you will press too." And amidst a breathless silence, the 9 members of the audience on the stage following every movement, Curtis put his hand inside the head of the coffin and touched a very slight elevation in the wood. In an instant, by a wonderfully neat piece of mechanism, a panel slid back, leaving just sufficient room for a man of moderate dimensions to squeeze through. Everyone now looked at John Martin. He was leaning back in his chair, breathing hard, his eyes starting out of his head, his cheeks white. Hamar saw him and grinned malevolently, but the smile died out of his face when he glanced at Gladys. The scorn in the girl's eyes made his blood boil. "All right, Miss Martin," he muttered between his teeth. "You adopt that attitude now, but you will adopt a very different one later on. I'll win you body and soul, or my name is not what it is." He was interrupted in this amiable reflection by Curtis. "I'm too stout to play the rôle of the corpse, and so is Matt," Curtis said to him. "You must undertake that part now," he went on. "Take this plug and get into the sack." And he whispered a few instructions in his ears. Then he tied the top of the sack, in reality tying it round the plug Hamar was holding, and one of the audience sealed the knot. Curtis and Kelson then lifted Hamar into the coffin, shut the lid and corded it. Then Curtis, turning to the audience, said: "What is now happening inside the coffin is this. The corpse pulls the plug out of the mouth of the sack from the inside. The cord thus becomes loose, and the corpse is able to open the sack. He at once touches the spring I pointed out to you in the head of the coffin, and the panel slides back so." And as the audience looked, they saw the panel slide back, and first all of Hamar's head, and then his body, wriggle through the aperture thus made. "The reason why you, audience, cannot see him make his escape is this," Curtis explained. "The head of the coffin is always turned away from you, and placed against a mirror which you can't see, and which to you appears but the continuation of the stage. In this mirror, exactly opposite the head of the coffin, is an aperture, and it is through this the corpse makes his exit to the back of the stage. I will show it you. Here it is," and beckoning to the referees to come quite close, he pointed to a glass screen, in the centre of the base of which was a glass trap door, corresponding in height and girth to the head of the coffin. "Here, corpse," Curtis said, "crawl through," and Hamar, looking as if he by no means appreciated the undignified task of wriggling on his stomach before so many eyes, drew himself as tight together as he could, and squirmed through. "Does that satisfy you, gentlemen?" Curtis inquired. "Perfectly," the referees answered. "Nothing would be plainer. We see exactly now how the trick is done." At this there was a loud outburst of clapping, and Curtis bowed in the elegant manner in which he had been patiently and assiduously coached by Kelson. He then proceeded to the second trick, Eve at the window, a trick almost, if not quite, as famous as the brass coffin, and for the solution of which Martin and Davenport had frequently offered huge sums of money. A large pane of glass, some 6 by 9 feet in area, and set in a frame, made to represent that of a window, is placed on the stage, about 18 inches from the floor. 36 inches from the ground, a wooden shelf is placed against the window. An assistant, usually a woman, then mounts on the shelf, and looking out of the glass, proceeds to kiss her hand vigorously. The operator in a shocked voice asks her to desist. She refuses, and to the amusement of the audience, carries on her pantomimic flirtation more desperately than before. The operator pretends to lose his temper, and snatching up a screen, places it at the back of her. He then fires a pistol, pulls aside the screen, and she has vanished. As the top, bottom, and sides of the window all, in fact, except the very middle have been in full view of the audience, and as the window has been tightly closed all the time, the disappearance of the girl completely mystifies the audience. Curtis explained it all. He pointed out that the keynote to the illusion lay behind the wooden shelf, which was so placed as to conceal the fact that the lower part of the window was made double, the bottom of the upper part being concealed from view by a second sheet of silvered glass placed in front of it. The shelf covers the line of junction, and enables the window frame to be scrutinized by the audience. As soon as the screen is put in front of the lady on the shelf, the glass pane slides up about 1.5 feet into the top of the frame, purposely made very deep. The bottom of the window is cut away in the middle, leaving an aperture about 2 feet square, which was previously hidden from view by the double glass at the base. Eve makes her exit through this hole and slides on to a board placed behind the window in readiness for her. The pane of glass then slides down again. The screen is removed, and the window appears just as solid as before. When Curtis concluded his verbal explanation, he gave the audience a practical illustration of how the thing was done. He manipulated the screen and pistol, whilst Hamar posed as Eve, and directly he had finished, there was another outburst of applause. Kelson dared not look at John Martin or Gladys. The brief glance he had taken of them at the conclusion of the giving away of the first trick had shocked him, and he purposely stood with his back to them. With Hamar it was otherwise. The joy of triumph was strong within him, and the picture of John Martin leaning forward in his chair, with his mouth half open and a dazed, glassy expression in his eyes, only thrilled him with pleasure. He laughed at the old man, and still more at Gladys. "That's the way to treat a girl of that sort," he whispered to Kelson. "Scoff at her well. Let her see you don't care a snap for her. In the end she'll run after you and haunt you to death."
"I'm not so sure," Kelson said. "It might act in some cases, perhaps, but I don't think you can quite depend on it."
"Pooh! You are no judge of women, in spite of all your experience," Hamar retorted. "I'll bet you anything you like she'll come round and make a tremendous fuss of me."
"Supposing you fall in love with her, how about the compact?" Kelson asked. "You've warned me often enough."
"Oh, but I'm not like you," Hamar replied. "There's nothing soft in my nature. I fall in love? Not much. Why, you might as well have apprehensions of my joining the Salvation Army, or wanting to become a militant suffragette. Either would be just about as possible. No, I shall make the girl love me, and we shall be engaged for just as long as I please. If I find someone that attracts me more, I shall throw her aside. If not, maybe, I shall marry her. But in either case there will be no question of love, at least not on my part. She shall do as I want, that is all. Hullo! Curtis is beginning again." There were 5 other tricks on the programme, all of which were world renowned. They were the floating head, the mango seed, the haunted bathing machine, the girl with the 5 eyes, and the vanishing bicycle illusion. As with the first 2 tricks, so Curtis did with the following 5. He explained them, and then, aided by Hamar and Kelson, gave practical demonstrations of their solutions. And so thoroughly and clearly were these solutions demonstrated that the referees asked no questions. They were absolutely satisfied. Turning to the audience, at a sign from Curtis, they announced that the whole of Messrs. Martin and Davenport's tricks had been solved to their entire satisfaction, and that Messrs. Hamar, Curtis and Kelson, of the Modern Sorcery Company Limited, had without doubt won the wager. "Have you anything to say?" Curtis asked, addressing John Martin. "I acknowledge my defeat, though I do not understand it," John Martin said, with very white lips. "I shall pay you the £10,000 to night." "Don't worry about that," Hamar interposed. "We don't want to take your money. All we wanted to do was prove to you we could perform the tricks you believed to be insoluble. Ladies and gentlemen," he went on, raising his voice, "the Modern Sorcery Company Limited has given you some proof to night of their capabilities in the conjuring line, and if you will give us the pleasure of your company to morrow night, we invite you all free of charge for the occasion. We will give you a still further demonstration of our powers. May we count upon your patronage?" A terrific storm of clapping was the reply, and as the audience slowly filed from the hall, John Martin staggered into the wing, reeled past Gladys ere she could catch him, and sank helplessly on to the floor. End of Chapter 12. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 13 of The Sorcery Club by Elliott O'Donnell. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 13. The Modern Sorcery Company Limited give a gratis performance. The days that followed were dark days for Gladys. Her father, whom she loved and until now had never realized how much she loved, lay seriously ill. He had had a stroke, which, although fortunately slight, must, as the doctor said, be regarded as a prelude to what would happen unless he was kept very quiet. And to keep him quiet was not an easy thing to do. His mind continually reverted to what had just taken place, and he was for ever asking Gladys to tell him whether anything further had occurred in connection with it, whether there was anything about it in the papers. Gladys, of course, was obliged to dissemble. She hated anything approaching dissimulation, but on this occasion there was no help for it, and what she told John Martin was the reverse of what she knew to be actually happening. The papers were full to overflowing with accounts of that fatal night's proceedings, and of the marvellous gratis exhibition given on the succeeding evening by the Modern Sorcery Company Limited. The Hooter, for example, had a full column on the middle page, headed in large type, "Extraordinary Scene at Martin and Davenport's. The greatest conjuring tricks in the world solved." Whilst the Daily Snapper, determined to be none the less sensational, began thus: "Mysteries no longer. The brass coffin trick and Eve at the window done at last. Martin and Davenport lose their prestige." This was bad enough, but the Planet published a paragraph that was even more galling. "Now that Messrs. Martin and Davenport's great illusions have been explained, and their hall in Kingsway, so long famous as the home of puzzledom, of necessity shorn of its glamour, one need not be surprised if those who delight in this kind of mystery should turn elsewhere for their amusement. The British public, which is above all things enamoured of novelty, will doubtless now resort to the Modern Sorcery Company, whose house in Cockspur Street bids fair to become the future home of everything uncanny. Their programme, to the uninitiated, presents possibilities and impossibilities." So said the Planet, and as the number of attendances at Martin and Davenport's fell from 820 on the night of the challenge to 89 on the succeeding night, whilst the Modern Sorcery Company's hall was filled to overflowing, there was every prospect of its prediction being verified. The solution of Martin and Davenport's tricks had taken place Hamar had so planned it on the last night the trio possessed the property of divination, and, consequently, on the night that terminated the first stage of their compact. The following night they would be in possession of new powers, such powers as would warrant them giving a gratis exhibition, an exhibition of jugglery absolutely new and unprecedented. That the exhibition was successful may be gathered from the following article in the Daily Cyclone: "Marvellous display of psychic phenomena in Cockspur Street. The Modern Sorcery Company Limited, in their new premises in Cockspur Street, gave the most remarkable display of phenomena it has ever yet fallen to our lot to report. Indeed, the performances were of such an extraordinary nature that the huge audience, en masse, was scared. Not a few people fainted, whilst every now and again were heard screams of terror intermingled with long protracted ohs." A brief résumé of the entertainment ran as follows: The first part of the Modern Sorcery Company's programme was carried out by Mr. Leon Hamar, solus, who, stepping to the front of the stage, announced that he was about to give a display of clairvoyance. Without further prelude he pointed to various members of the audience, and described spiritual presences he saw standing behind them. He did not say he could see a spirit, answering to the name of James or George, or some such equally familiar name, and then proceed to give a description of it so elastic that with every little stretching it would undoubtedly have fitted 9 out of every 10 people one meets with every day. But unlike any other clairvoyance we have known, he described the individual physical and moral traits of the people he professed to see. For example, to a lady sitting in the third row of the stalls he said: "There is the phantasm of an elderly gentleman standing behind you. He has a vivid scar on his right cheek that looks as if it might have been caused by a sabre cut. He has a grey military moustache, a very marked chin, wears his hair parted in the middle, and has light blue eyes that are fixed ferociously on the gentleman seated on your left. Do you recognize the person I am describing?" "I think so," the lady answered in a faint voice. "I will spare you a description of his person," Hamar went on, "but I should like to remind you that he met with a rather peculiar accident. He was looking over some engineering works in Leeds when some one pushed him, and he was instantly whipped off the ground by a piece of revolving mechanism and dashed to pieces against the ceiling. Am I right?" There was no reply, but the sigh, we think, was more significant than words. Mr. Hamar then turned to a lady in the next row. "I can see behind you," he said, "an old dowager with yellow hair. She wears large emerald drop earrings, black satin skirt, and a heliotrope bodice of which she appears to be somewhat vain. She is coughing terribly. She died of pneumonia brought about by the excessive zeal of her relatives for the open air treatment. Contrary to expectations, however, all her money went to a society in Hanover Square, a society for the anti propagation of children. I think you know the lady to whom I refer." Mr. Hamar had again hit the mark. "Only too well," came the indignant and spontaneous reply. Mr. Hamar then turned to a man in the fifth row. "Hulloa!" he exclaimed. "What have we here? An Irish terrier answering to the name of Peg. It is standing upright with its two front paws resting on your knees. It is looking up into your face, and its mouth is open as if anticipating a lump of sugar. From the marks on its body, I should say it has been killed by being run over?" Again Mr. Hamar was correct. "What you say is absolutely true," the gentleman replied. "I had a dog named Peg. I was greatly attached to it, and it was run over in Piccadilly by a motor cyclist. I hate the very sight of a motor bicycle." After a brief interval of awestruck silence, a voice from the gallery called out, "You are in league with him." Then the man in the stalls stood up and essayed to speak, but his voice was drowned in a perfect tornado of applause. He had no need. He was instantly recognized. He was J.B. With a few more examples of clairvoyance, Mr. Hamar continued to entertain his audience for half an hour or so, by the end of which time we have no hesitation in saying that everyone was convinced that he actually saw what he said he saw. The second part of the programme was entirely in the hands of Mr. Curtis, who now came forward with a bow. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "you all know that man is complex, that he is composed of mind and matter, the material and immaterial. I now propose to give you a physical demonstration of this fact. Will 12 of the audience kindly come up on the stage and sit around me, so that you may feel quite certain that I have here no mechanical devices to assist me?" And amongst other well known people who responded to Mr. Curtis's request were Lord Bayle, Sir Charles Tenningham, and the Right Honourable John Blaine, M.P. Having arranged these 12 volunteers in a semicircle at the back of the stage, Mr. Curtis, standing in the centre of the stage, again addressed his audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "the secret of separating the mind, or what spiritualists who love to bolster up their pretended knowledge of the other world by the invention of pretentious nomenclature, call the ethical ego, from the body, lies in intense concentration. If you wish to acquire the power, practice concentration. Concentrate on being in a certain place. If nothing happens at first, don't be discouraged, but keep on trying, and a time will come when you will suddenly leave your body, in a form which is the exact counterpart of the body you have left. You will visit the place whereon you are concentrating. Perhaps the best method of practising projection is to put your forehead against a door or wall, and concentrate very hard on being on the other side. It may take weeks before you get a result, but if you persevere you will eventually succeed in leaving your physical form and passing through the door or wall into the space beyond. Now watch me. I shall concentrate on projecting my immaterial body, and of walking in it, 3 times round my material body." Mr. Curtis closed his eyes, and for some seconds appeared to be thinking very hard. Then the audience witnessed a remarkable phenomenon. A figure, the exact counterpart of Mr. Curtis, stepped out, as it were, from his body, and slowly walking round it 3 times, deliberately glided into it, and apparently amalgamated with it. The 12 members from the audience who were within a few feet of the alleged ethereal body as it walked past them, declared they saw it most vividly, and that feature for feature, detail for detail, it was the exact counterpart of Mr. Curtis, whose material body remained standing upright and motionless, with its eyes tightly closed. Our representative questioned several of these eye witnesses very closely, and they were all most emphatic in their belief that what they had seen was a bona fide case of spiritual projection. At the request of a large part of the audience, Mr. Curtis repeated his demonstration, a further complement of men from the stalls joining those already on the stage to witness the operation. Several tests were now applied to the ethereal body of Mr. Curtis, as it walked round his material body. One man, clutching at its sleeve, tried to detain it, but his hand passed through the sleeve and held nothing. Another man put out an arm to act as a barrier, and the projection, without swerving from its course, passed right through it, and, on the completion of the third round, disappeared as before. In answer to inquiries, Mr. Curtis stated that the phenomenon might be taken as a good illustration of projections, and that he was prepared to project himself once again in order to prove that it was erroneous to suppose that phantasms could not do all manner of physical actions. A deal table upon which stood a tumbler and jug of water, a grandfather clock and a piano were brought on to the stage, and Mr. Curtis again projected his spirit form. The latter at once walked to the table, and, taking up the tumbler, filled it with water from the jug, after which it wound up the clock, and, sitting down on a seat in front of the piano, played "Killarney" and "The Star Spangled Banner," and then, amidst the wildest applause, the first time assuredly a ghost has ever received public plaudits in recognition of its services, it modestly re entered its physical home. Mr. Curtis then announced that not only could he project his ethereal body from his material body in the manner he had already demonstrated, but that with his ethereal body he could amalgamate with inorganic matter. He bade those on the stage approach the table in convenient numbers, that is, 2 or 3 at a time, and listen attentively. He then took his stand on one side of the stage, about 14 feet from the table, and the audience, approaching the table and listening attentively, first of all heard it pulsate as with the throbbings of a heart, and then breathe with the deep and heavy respirations of someone in a sound sleep. The table then raised itself some 3 or 4 inches from the ground and moved round the stage, at the conclusion of which feat Mr. Curtis informed the audience that table turning, when not accomplished through the trickery of one of the sitters, was frequently performed by the work of some earthbound spirit, usually an elemental, that could amalgamate with any piece of furniture, in precisely the same way as his own projection had amalgamated with the table in front of them. "Elementals," Mr. Curtis continued, "are responsible for many of the foolish and purposeless tricks performed at séances, and for the unintelligible and useless kind of answers the table so often raps out. The best you can hope for from an elemental is amusement. It will never give you any reliable information, nor will it ever do you any good." With these words, Mr. Curtis' share in the entertainment concluded. He retired to the wings, whilst Mr. Kelson stepped forward, begged those several gentlemen who, on Mr. Curtis's exit, had reseated themselves among the audience, once again to step up on to the stage. "Be good enough," he said, addressing them in his most polite manner, "to observe me very closely. I am about to give you a few further examples of what intense mental concentration can do, thus proving to you to what an unlimited extent mind can gain dominion over matter. You all know that will power can overcome any of the internal physical forces. For instance, when you have tooth or earache, you have only to say to yourselves, 'I shan't suffer,' and the suffering ceases. But what you may not know, what you may not have realized, is that will power can overrule external forces and principles, as, for example, gravity. As a matter of fact, airships and aeroplanes are absolutely superfluous, and the time, money, and labour they involve is a prodigious waste. Any man with strong mental capacity can fly without the aid of mechanism. He has only to will himself to be in the air, and he is there. Look! and to the amazement, the indescribable, unparalleled amazement of all present, Mr. Kelson knit his brows as if engaged in intense thought, and, jumping off his feet, remained in the air at a height of some 4 feet from the floor. At his request, members of the audience came up to him and passed their hands under, over, and all around him, to make sure there were no wires. He then struck out with his hands and legs after the manner of a swimmer, and moving first of all round the stage, and then over the stalls and pit, gradually ascended higher and higher till he reached the level of the boxes, to the occupants of which he spoke. Such an extraordinary spectacle, which apparently gives the lie to all our preconceived notions of gravity, has certainly never before been witnessed, and the effect it had on those who saw it baffles description. When Mr. Kelson returned to the stage, and the terrific applause that greeted his arrival there had subsided, he gave the audience a few valuable hints as to how they too might accomplish this feat. "Practise concentration," he said, "and develop your will power, if only by a very little every day. Jump off a stool to begin with, saying to yourself as you do so, 'I will remain in the air. I won't touch the ground.' And though you may fail for the 100th time, if only you keep on trying, you will eventually succeed. To keep your equilibrium on a bicycle is a feat which would have been pronounced utterly impossible by your ancestors of 200 years ago, but just as that power came to you, after many futile efforts, all at once, so in the end will flying come to you. See, I am now going to rise to the highest point in the building. Gravity pulls me back, but I say to myself, 'I will rise, I will fly there,' and fly there I do." And, springing off the ground, he struck out with his arms and legs, flew swiftly and easily to the dome of the hall, which he touched, and then flew back again to the stage. This completed the evening's entertainment. If only on the strength of its first performance, the Modern Sorcery Company, in our opinion, has more than justified its name. And although we understand they will give no more performances gratis, we feel confident in prophesying that for many a long night there will be no falling off in the attendance. End of chapter 13. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 14 of the Sorcery Club by Elliott O'Donnell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 14. Shield to the Rescue. Gladys did not feel too happy when she read notices such as these. She could not do other than see in them the destruction to her father, and the worst of it all was that she could do nothing to help him. Who could? Who could possibly invent anything as wonderful as the marvels of the Modern Sorcery Club Limited? And yet, unless John Martin gave up altogether, that is what he must do. Nay, he must do more. He must not only equal the Modern Sorcery Company's marvels, he must eclipse them. But after the affair of the challenge, it seemed to Gladys that there was no help for it. The hall would have to be closed for a time. Now that Dick Davenport was dead, there was no one to take her father's place. On the night succeeding the catastrophe, she had persuaded one of the Indian attendants to undertake the rôle of operator, but his skill was not equal to the tax upon it, and the audience, a poor one, was very lukewarm in its applause. The following day she talked the matter over with her father. The latter was in favour of keeping the show on at any cost; Gladys for closing it temporarily. "A bad performance is worse than no performance," she said. "Much better to close till you have invented some new tricks." John Martin groaned. "I fear my days of invention are over," he muttered. "If I can read the papers and write letters, that will be about as much as I shall be able to do." "Couldn't you retire?" "I would if I were not a Britisher," John Martin replied. "But being a Britisher, I'd sooner shoot myself than give in to a damned Yankee." And Gladys, in terror lest her father should over excite himself, promised that she would see that the entertainment was carried on as usual, and that the Indian continued on in the rôle of operator. But when out of her father's presence, Gladys gave way to despair. How could she, a woman, hope to cope with such a difficult situation? And she was racking her brains to know how to act for the best, when Shiel was announced. A wave of relief swept over her. She could explain her difficulties to Shiel in a way that she could not to anyone who had no knowledge at all of her father's affairs, and she told him just how matters stood. "Look here," he exclaimed, when she had finished, "why not let me take your father's place at the Kingsway? I have done a little amateur acting, and am not nervous at the thought of appearing in public. Your father confided in you so much, you must know all his tricks by heart. Couldn't you coach me?" Gladys looked at him critically. "It wouldn't be half a bad idea," she said. "Supposing you come with me to the Hall. I can explain the tricks better if I show you the apparatus at the same time." Shiel thoroughly enjoyed the journey up to town. He knew it was wrong of him to think of his own pleasure when the affairs of his companion were in such a critical condition. He knew he ought not to look at her in the way he did, as if she was the most precious thing in the world, and he would give her his soul if she wanted it. He knew that he, a penniless artist without any prospects, had no right to behave thus. But her beauty appealed to him with a force he was entirely incapable of resisting, and he went on looking at her in the way he knew he ought not to look at her, simply because he couldn't help it. He lunched with her at her club in Dover Street, and then they taxied to the Kingsway. The doorkeeper, the only living creature in the building, saving themselves, seemed to share in the general depression hanging over everything. The great, empty front of the house, with its gloomy, cavernous boxes and grim, grey gallery, the dark, dismal flies, the chilly wings, all hushed and still, and impregnated with the sense of desertion. But with this man beside her, who, she knew, would do anything he could to help, the place did not look quite so bad to Gladys as it had done the day before. There was a ray of light now where before ebon blackness had prevailed. Without delay Gladys rang up the Indian attendants on the telephone, and occupied the time prior to their arrival by describing to Shiel how each of the tricks was done. Her pupil proved far more able than she had anticipated. After several rehearsals he was able to go through the whole performance without a hitch. When they had finished, Gladys stretched out her hand impulsively. "I don't know how to thank you enough," she said. "You are a brick, and if only you do half as well this evening as you have done now, we shall get on swimmingly. That is to say, as well as we can expect until we can arrange a fresh programme. If only you were an inventor." "If only I were! If only I had money!" "Why, what would you do?" Gladys asked curiously. "Give it to you. Give you every halfpenny of it. But, as I haven't any, I mean to give you all the energy I possess instead." "Why me? My father, you mean?" "No, you," Shiel said impulsively. "Both of you, if you prefer it. But you first." "Me first? That doesn't seem very lucid. But I can't stay to hear an explanation now, for if I miss the 4:30 train I shall miss my dinner, which would indeed be a calamity." And slipping on her gloves she hurried off, forbidding Shiel to escort her further. Left to himself, Shiel strolled along the Strand into the Victoria Gardens, where he bought an evening paper, and sat down to read it. The first thing that caught his eye was: "Magic in London. This morning the West End received a shock. About 12 o'clock a gentleman, fashionably dressed, turned into Bond Street from Piccadilly, and when opposite Messrs. Truefitt's, prepared to cross over. The street happened just then to be blocked by a long line of taxis. The gentleman, however, had no intention of waiting till they had passed. Measuring the distance from one pavement to the other with his eyes, he jumped about 15 feet into the air and cleared the intervening space without the slightest apparent effort, a feat that literally paralysed with astonishment all who beheld it. On being remonstrated by a policeman, who was highly perplexed as to whether such extraordinary conduct constituted a breach of the peace or not, the gentleman calmly leaped over the policeman's head, and striking out with arms and legs, swam through the air. Continuing in this fashion, the cynosure of all eyes, even the traffic being suspended to watch him, he passed along Bond Street into Oxford Street, where he once more alighted on his feet. On being questioned by a representative of the press, it transpired that he was Mr. Kelson, one of the partners in the Modern Sorcery Company Limited, whose wonderful performances at their hall in Cockspur Street have already been reported in these columns. "I should well like to know how that flying trick is done," Shiel said to himself. "According to Kelson, it is entirely a question of will power. I'll see if I can't develop my concentrative faculty, and introduce a few of the same performances in our show. I'll go to the hall and try them now." But his preliminary efforts were certainly far from successful. He jumped off chairs, saying to himself, "I will fly! I will fly!" and he struck out heroically each time, but the result was always the same. Gravity conquered. He fell. Had he not been so much in love with Gladys, he would have desisted. As it was, the more he bumped and bruised himself, the more determined he was to go on trying. In fact, flying with him became a mania, and according to the daily journals, his was by no means the only case. All over England people were trying to fly. An old lady in Gipsy Hill appeared in the police court to answer a charge of causing annoyance to her neighbours by practising flying from off her bed at night. Her bulk being large and her will power apparently small, she yielded to gravity and landed on the ground with prodigious bumps, which set everything in the room vibrating, and which could be plainly heard in the adjoining houses, through the thin brick walls on either side of her room. An old gentleman in Guilsborough had an extremely narrow escape. Being warned on no account to practise flying in the house or garden, lest his grandchildren should see him and want to do the same, he retired to the seclusion of an old, disused and dilapidated coach house. Here, in the upper story, he practised by the hour together. He climbed on a stool which he had taken there for the purpose, and when he fancied he had acquired the right amount of concentration, he sprang into the air, arriving, presumably through want of will power, on the floor. For 2 whole days he practised bump, 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 and the more he bumped the more he persevered. At last, however, the floor gave way, and with loud cries of "I will! I will!" he fell on the ground floor 10 feet below. He was unable to go on experimenting, owing to a broken leg and a fractured collar bone. At Aylsham, Norfolk, there had been a perfect epidemic among the children for trying aeronic gravity. Rudolph Crabb, aged 5, after listening to an account of the performances at the Modern Sorcery Company's hall, which his father had read aloud, sprang off the dining room table, crying out, "I will fly! I will stay in the air!" Fortunately he fell on the tabby cat, which somewhat broke the shock of concussion, and he escaped unhurt. In College Road, Clifton, Bristol, an octogenarian, thinking he would add novelty to the Jubilee celebrations at the college, leaped off the roof of his house, crying, "I'll fly over the close! I will fly over the close!" and he broke his neck. In St. Ives, Cornwall, where the treatment of animals is none too humane, a fisher boy threw a visitor's Pomeranian over the Malakoff, saying, "You shall fly! You shall remain in the air!" whilst at Bath a girl of 10, snatching her baby brother from the perambulator, leaped over Beechen Cliff, calling out, "We will fly together! We will fly together!" These are only a few of the many similar cases Shiel read in the paper, and which he narrated afterwards to Gladys Martin. "I am quite convinced," Gladys said, "that Kelson does his flying through supernatural agency. His assertion that it can be done through mere will power is sheer humbug. It wouldn't be a bad idea to consult a clairvoyant. What do you think?" Shiel thought it was an excellent suggestion. He saw in it an opportunity of spending yet another afternoon in Gladys's company, and asked her to go with him to an occultist the very next day. When she assented, the pleasure of it tingled through every pore of his skin. Of course, Gladys assured herself there was no harm in her acceptance of Shiel's escort, that neither he nor she meant anything by it, that it was on her part merely a sort of acknowledgment that he had been awfully good to her in her present predicament. Besides, if she needed further excuse, she had no reason for supposing Shiel to be in love with her, and had her father not spoken to her about it, she would not have remarked anything different in his glances from the glances, for the time being perhaps earnest enough, bestowed upon her by other young men, which excuse was certainly, in Gladys's case, a more or less honest one. They had some difficulty in selecting a psychometrist, so numerous were those who advertised, in an equally alluring manner, but they at length decided in favour of Madame Elvita, whose consulting rooms were in New Bond Street. When they arrived there, Madame Elvita was of course engaged. Shiel was delighted, it gave him an extra half hour with Gladys. When Madame was free she had much to tell them. First of all she spoke to them of karmas, kamadevas, rupadevas, vitalized shells, etheric doubles, the nirmanakaya, and afterwards solemnly announced that she must relapse into a state of clairvoyance in order to get in touch with Tilly Toot, a certain spirit from whom she could learn all that Gladys and Shiel wanted to know. Accordingly, in the manner of most other 2 guinea clairvoyants, she composed herself in a graceful and recumbent attitude, made a lot of queer grimaces and still queerer noises, and spoke in a falsetto voice which proposed to be that of Tilly Toot, once a barmaid in Edinburgh, now one of Madame's familiar spirits. And the gist of what Tilly told them was that Hamar and Company derived their powers from black magic, and that the secrets thereof could only be learned from Madame, after a series of sittings with her, sittings for which Madame would only require a fee of 50 guineas, a most moderate, in fact quite trifling sum, considering the wonderful instruction they would receive. But Madame's magnanimous offer tempted neither Gladys nor Shiel, and they abruptly took their departure. Katarowski, née Jones, in Regent Street, whom Gladys and Shiel had agreed to consult in the event of a non-successful visit to Madame Elvita in Bond Street, also told them that black magic was the key to Hamar, Curtis and Kelson's performances. She advised them to get on the astral plane, where they would meet spirits who would give them all the information they desired. Madame Katarowski's instructions were simple. "It is really a matter of faith," she said. "All you have to do is go to some secluded spot. The privacy of your bedroom will do admirably. Sit down, close your eyes, look into your lids and concentrate hard. After a while you will no longer see your eyelids. Your lids will fade away and you will be on the astral plane and see strange creatures, which although terrifying won't harm you. When you get used to them you will communicate with them and learn from them all you want to know." "Shall we try?" Gladys remarked laughingly at Shiel as they stepped into the street. "But if faith is essential to success, I fear failure, as far as I am concerned, is a foregone conclusion. I know I shouldn't have sufficient faith." "Nor I either," Shiel said, "but perhaps we could acquire a necessary amount of it, if we were to experiment together. Supposing we try in that delightfully secluded copse in your garden?" Gladys shook her head. "I'm afraid it would be useless. Besides, if my father were to hear of it, he would fear worry had turned my brain, and most likely have another fit. No, we must think of something more practical. In the meanwhile, if you will keep on with the part you have so generously undertaken, you will be doing me an inestimable service." "Then I'll stop on with it for ever," Shiel replied, and before she could stop him he kissed her hand. Chapter 14. By Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 15 of The Sorcery Club by Elliott O'Donnell. This recording is in the public domain. By Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 15. How Hamar, Curtis and Kelson entered the Astral Plane. In order to explain the manner in which Hamar, Kelson and Curtis were initiated into their new properties, I must now go back to the day preceding the gratis performance of the Modern Sorcery Company, that is to say, the last day of Stage 1 of the Compact. To Kelson the day had been one of the surprises throughout. When he arrived at the building in Cockspur Street he preferred living alone, and consequently rented a handsome suite of rooms in John Street, Mayfair he was not a little astonished to meet Lilian Rosenberg on the staircase. "I thank you so much," she exclaimed, shaking hands with him most effusively. "It is all owing to you. I got the post." "Then Hamar has engaged you?" Kelson ejaculated. "Why, yes.
Didn't you know?" Lilian said with a smile. "I had a letter from him the very evening of the day I called here." "Did you? He never told me anything about it. How do you think you will get on?" "Oh, splendidly. The work is interesting and full of variety. Moreover, I like the atmosphere of the place. It is so weird, I believe the three of you really are magicians." "If that be so," Kelson said, "then we have only acted in accordance with our character in engaging the services of a witch who has already bewitched one member of the trio. Now please don't go to the expense of lunching out. Lunch with me instead. Lunch with me every day." "It is very kind of you," Lilian Rosenberg replied, "and I will gladly do so when I am not lunching with Mr. Hamar, but he has invited me to have all my meals with him." "That doesn't mean you are obliged to have them with him every day," Kelson cried. "Lunch with me this morning." "I'm very sorry," Lilian Rosenberg replied, looking at Kelson with mock pleading eyes. "Please don't scold me, but I've really promised Mr. Hamar." "Have tea with me then," Kelson said. "I've promised him that too." "Supper then," Kelson said savagely. "I'm awfully sorry, but I'm engaged all this evening and practically every evening." "With Mr. Hamar?" Kelson asked suspiciously. "Oh, no, my own private business," Lilian Rosenberg replied. "Do forgive me. I should so like to have been able to accept your invitation. Now I must hurry back to my work," and she gave him her hand, which Kelson held, and would have gone on holding all the morning had he not heard Hamar's well known tread ascending the stairs. "Look here," he said as they entered his room together, "I want Miss Rosenberg to have luncheon with me one day this week, and she tells me you have already invited her. Let her come with me to morrow."
"It is impossible," Hamar said. "Now I'll tell you what it is, Matt. I anticipated this the moment I saw you two together, and it's got to stop. You would genuinely fall in love with that girl, or as a matter of fact any other pretty girl, if you saw much of her, and love, I tell you, would be absolutely disastrous to our interests. You must let her alone, absolutely alone, I tell you. I have given her strict orders she is to confine herself to her work and to me."
"I think you take a great deal too much on yourself. I shall see just as much of Miss Rosenberg, when she is disengaged, as I please."
"Then she shall never be disengaged. But come, do be sane and put some restraint on this mad infatuation of yours for pretty faces. Can't you keep it in check anyhow for 2 years, till after the term of the compact has expired? Then you will be free to indulge it to your heart's content. For heaven's sake be guided by me. Harmony between us must be kept at all costs. Don't you understand?"
"Oh, yes, I understand all right," Kelson said, "and I'll try. But it's very hard, and I really don't see there would be any danger in my taking her out occasionally."
"Well, I do," Hamar replied, "and there's an end. To turn to something that may spell business. Just before I got up this morning I saw a striped figure bending over me."
"A striped figure?"
"Yes, a cylindrical figure about 7 feet high, without any visible limbs, but which gave me the impression it had limbs of a sort if it cared to show them."
"You were frightened?"
"Naturally. So would you have been. It didn't speak, but in some indefinable manner it conveyed to me the purport of its visit. To night at 12 o'clock we are to go to the house of a Hindu called Karaver in Berners Street, where we shall be initiated into the second stage of our compact."
"I hope to goodness we shan't see any spectral trees or striped figures. I've had enough of them," Kelson said.
"Then take care you don't do anything that might lead to the breaking of the compact," Hamar retorted. "Otherwise you'll see something far worse."
Shortly before midnight, Hamar, Curtis and Kelson, obeying the injunctions Hamar had received, set off to Berners Street, where they had little difficulty in finding Karaver's house. To their astonishment, Karaver was expecting them.
"How did you know we were coming?" Curtis asked.
"A gentleman called here early this morning and told me," Karaver explained. "He said 3 friends of his particularly wished to be on the astral plane at 12 o'clock this evening, and that they would each pay me 100 guineas if I would show them how to get there. I demurred. The secrets that have come down to me through generations of my Kashmir ancestors I tell only to a chosen few, those born under the sign of Djelam Brava. The stranger showing me the sign, written plainer than I have ever seen it, in the palm of his hand, I at once consented, and I had no sooner done so than he vanished. I knew then that I had been speaking to an Elemental, a spirit of my native mountains."
"My nerves are not in a condition to stand much. Is there anything very alarming in this astral business?" Kelson asked.
"It depends on what you call alarming," the Indian said coldly. "I shouldn't be alarmed."
"Don't be a fool, Matt," Hamar interposed. "I never saw such a frightened idiot in my life. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Think of what there is at stake." "Think of Lilian Rosenberg," Curtis whispered, "and be comforted." Karaver took them upstairs into a dimly lighted attic. In the centre of the carpetless floor was a tripod, around which the three were told to sit. Karaver then proceeded to pour into an iron vessel a mixture composed of 1/2 ounce of hemlock, 3/4 ounce of henbane, 2 ounces of opium, 1 ounce of mandrake roots, 2 ounces of poppy seeds, 1/2 ounce of asafoetida, and 1/4 ounce of saffron.
"Are these preparations absolutely necessary?" Kelson asked.
"Absolutely," Karaver said. "English clairvoyants will doubtless tell you they are not necessary. It is their custom, with a few slipshod instructions, to lead you to suppose that getting on the astral plane is merely child's play. It is not. It is extremely difficult, and can only be done, in the first place, through the guidance of a skilled Oriental occultist."
He then took a sword, and with it making the sign of a triangle in the air, afterwards scratched a triangle on the floor, over which in red chalk he superscribed a tree, an eye, and a hand. Then he heated the mixture in the iron vessel over an oil stove. As soon as fumes arose from it he placed it on the tripod, crying, "Great spirits of the mountains, rivers and bowels of the earth, invest me with the heavy seal, in order that I may conduct these three seekers after knowledge to the realms of thy eternal phantoms." Immediately after this oration, Karaver, dipping a twig of hazel in the fumigation, waved it north, south, east and west, crying, "Give me authority! Give me Kataladrani!" and then, kneeling down in front of the brazier, in a droning voice, repeated these words: "Green phantom figures of the air, a ready welcome see that you prepare. Black phantom figures from the earth, of friendly salutations see there is no dearth. Red phantom figures of the furious fire, for kindly greeting change your usual ire. Grey, grisly googies from the woods and dells, to gentle whisperings change your harrowing yells. Flogai, Devas, Mararupas." Footnote 19. According to Brahminical teaching there are 7 main classes of spirits, some having innumerable subdivisions. They are: 1. Aripadevas with forms. 2. Aripadevas without forms. Both classes 1 and 2 are intelligent. 6 principles of certain planets. I style them Planetians, and classify them with all other spirits hailing from Jupiter, Neptune, etc. 3. Mararupas, identical with vice elements. 4. Pisachas, i.e. male and female elementaries. I have termed them impersonating elementals, since they consist of the astral forms of the dead that may be utilized by elementals. 5. Asuras, i.e. gnomes, pixies, etc., corresponding to those I have designated Vagrarian elementals. 6. Monstrosities. These I include among vice elementals and Vagrarians. 7. Kaksasas, such as souls of wizards, witches, and of clever people with evil tendencies. scientists with cruel or harsh tendencies, such as vivisectionists and sophists. All these come under my division of earth-bound phantasms of the dead, spirits tied to this earth by passion or vices. And I should add to the list militant suffragettes, strike agitators, hooligans, Apaches, pseudo-humanitarians, religious bigots, misers, all people obsessed with manias, idiots, epileptic imbeciles, and criminal lunatics. All such may at times be encountered on the lowest spiritual plane. High to the plane, the astral plane, and to these three poor fools explain, the secrets that they wish to learn. The mixture in the iron vessel was now giving off such dense fumes that Hamar, Curtis and Kelson felt their senses slowly ebbing away. The dark, lithe form of Karaver, his swarthy face and gleaming teeth receded farther and farther into the background, whilst his voice appeared to grow fainter and fainter. They were dimly conscious that he sprayed them all over with some sweet smelling scent. Footnote 20: Composed of 2 drachms of myrrh, 1/2 ounce of sweet oil, 2 ounces of attar of roses, 1/2 ounce heliotrope, and 1/4 ounce of musk. And that he whispered, in reality he spoke in his normal tones, these words: Darkuna, Droomer, Doober, Parler, Poomer, Perler, Atarama, Skatarenek, Uk, Drux, Numig, Viarticorsa. Footnote 21. These words are so arranged as to set in vibration and loosen the atmosphere that keeps the spirit incarcerated in the physical body, and so set the latter free. Then there came a temporary blank, which was broken by a sudden burst of light. The light, at first, was so blinding that they involuntarily closed their eyes. It was quite different to any light they had been accustomed to. It was far more vivid, and was in a perpetual state of vibration. When they had got sufficiently used to this dazzling effect to keep their eyes open, they became aware that they were standing apparently on nothing, that the atmosphere was not composed of air, such as they knew, but of an indescribable something that rendered the act of breathing wholly unnecessary, and that all around them was no ground, no scenery, but only space. They had barely finished remarking on these facts when there suddenly glided across their vision forms of every conceivable shape, that is, those resembling corpses of human beings and animals with bloodless faces, glassy eyes and stiff limbs, some apparently just dead and others in an advanced state of decomposition, all possessed and propelled by impersonating elementals, phantoms of actual earth-bound people, misers, murderers, etc., several of whom approached the trio and tried to peer into their faces. "For heaven's sake, keep off!" Kelson shrieked, as the vibrating form of an epileptic imbecile, with protruding blue eyes and pimply cheeks, came up to him and thrust his face into his. "This is a bit thick," Hamar said, vainly attempting to elude the phantom of a short, stout woman with a big head and purple face, who, putting out a large, black, swollen tongue, leered at him. "Curse you, damn you!" Curtis screamed, throwing out his hands in a vain endeavour to beat off the phantoms of 2 idiot boys who were trying to bite him with their loose, dribbling mouths. "A little more of this and I shall go mad." Seeing a tall, grey phantom with a man's body and a wolf's head bounding up to them, Kelson would have run away had not Hamar, whose presence of mind never quite deserted him, gripped him by the arm. "If you leave us, Matt," he said, "we are lost. I feel our safety depends on our keeping together. If I'm not mistaken, this is a cunning dodge on the part of the Unknown to separate us. If that happens, I feel we may never get back to our bodies, and the compact will then be broken. We must hang on to each other at all costs." So saying, he slipped his free arm through that of Curtis, and the three stood linked together. Hamar clung on to the other 2 until his hands grew numb, and the sweat stood on his chest and forehead in great beads. As figure after figure stealthily and noiselessly approached them, Kelson and Curtis writhed and shrieked, and at times it seemed as if the chain must be broken. But alarming as were these harrowing types of vice elementals, that is, nude things with heads of beasts and bodies of men and women, grotesque heads, malevolent eyes, mal shaped hands, headless beasts, etc., none had so dangerous an effect on the unity of the trio as the alluring types of vice elementals, that is, shapes of beautiful women that smiled seductively at Kelson, and resorted to every device to entice him away with them. It was then that Hamar was taxed to the utmost, that he exhausted voice, strength, and patience in holding Kelson back. He was about to give in, when to his astonishment those vice elementals vanished, and a phantasm, the exact counterpart of Karaver, only much taller, appeared before them, and commenced giving them instructions as to stage 2.
"You," he said, addressing Hamar, "will possess the property of second sight, that is, the power to see at will earthbound spirits, conditionally that you fumigate your room for 10 minutes every night before retiring to rest with a mixture composed of 2 drachms of henbane, 2 drachms of saffron, 1/2 ounce of aloes, 1/4 ounce of mandrake, 3 drachms of solanum, 2 ounces of asafoetida, that you abstain from animal food and wine, and give up smoking, that 3 times every day you bathe your face in distilled water, to which has been added 3 drops of the juice of the whortleberry, 1 drop of the juice of the mountain ashberry, 1 ounce of lavender water, 1 ounce of nitre, and 1/2 ounce of tincture of arnica, and that just before going to sleep you look for 3 minutes without blinking at an equilateral triangle transcribed in blood on white paper, and composed of these letters and figures," and he handed Hamar a piece of paper on which were written these symbols: KTOPI6X7-4HIP3S4WV28. "So long as you observe these conditions, the power will remain with you. To morrow only it will be awarded you without any preparations. You," he went on, turning to Kelson, "will possess the property of projection, that is, the power of leaving your body and of visiting where you will on the material plane. You will continue to possess the same, conditionally that you carry out the same rules as Leon Hamar, with the exception that, instead of looking at a triangle before going to sleep, you will repeat these words. See, I have written them down for you," and he handed Kelson a slip of paper on which were transcribed: Darkona, Droomer, Duber, Parler, Poomer, Perler, Atarama Scatarinek, Ook, Drooks, Numeg, Viarta Corsa. "You," he said, turning to Curtis, "will be endowed with the property of overcoming gravity. You will be able to fly, to jump great heights, and to lift and move prodigious weights. And this property will remain in your possession during the prescribed period, provided you abstain from all animal food, from smoking, and from drinking alcohol, and observe the same rules with regard to fumigating your sleeping apartment and bathing your face as Hamar and Kelson. But always, before you attempt to fly or jump, it will be necessary for you to set in motion certain vibrations in the ether that counteract the attraction of gravity. You must repeat the words Karjako Mandarbsa Guasila, which I have written on this blue paper, and when you want to move or lift objects you must first repeat the words Parababo Hinali Okokokotsi, which I have written on this green paper. Gravity, as you will see, is entirely dependent on sound. Sound can move mountains. It did so in Atlantis. It did so in Egypt." Making the sign of a triangle, an eye, and a tree in the air with the forefinger of his left hand, he slowly repeated the words Barjavka Ukputa Trilisa
and the concluding syllable was no sooner uttered than the trio found themselves standing in Berners Street. But of Karaver's house, the house they had just quitted, there was no trace. End of section 15. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 16 of The Sorcery Club by Elliott O'Donnell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 16 Hamar Makes Advances. The doctors had stated that the 10th day would see the crisis of John Martin's illness. If he could tide over that period, he might go on for years without another attack. When the momentous day arrived, Gladys was simply eating her heart out with suspense. Not a sound was permitted in the house. The servants, tiptoeing about, hardly ventured even to exchange glances. The errand boys were waylaid and sent to the right about, with a vague notion that if they opened their mouths their heads would be off. And someone was posted at the garden gate to deal, in a scarcely less summary manner, with visitors. Indeed, so fearful was Gladys lest her father should hear Shiel, who had managed to elude her outpost, that without meaning it, she greeted him curtly, and more plainly than politely gave him to understand that she wished him elsewhere.
"What have you been saying to Shiel Davenport?" Miss Templeton asked Gladys when they met at lunch. "I passed him in the road just now, and he looked so wretched that, despite his ineligibility, I felt quite sorry for him. I'm sure he is very much in love with you."
"Nonsense," Gladys said. "He's only a boy."
But boy though it pleased her to call him, she knew that he had played a man's part during her father's illness. Every night he had faithfully performed the rôle she had allotted to him at the Kingsway Hall, and upon him she was forced to admit the success of the entertainment, in a large measure, depended. Without pushing himself or being the least bit officious, he had been equally helpful behind the scenes. He had held in check all those who, taking advantage of her father's absence, were disposed to dispute her authority and shirk their work, and he had also on her behalf successfully resisted their demand for higher wages. And, over and above all this, he had always considered her personal comfort. Her meals, which she could never bother about for herself when engaged all day at the Hall, were, thanks to him, brought to her as punctually and served as daintily as they would have been for her father. He had taken every care that she should not be disturbed when resting, and there was, in short, nothing he had not thought of doing to lighten the load so unexpectedly laid upon her shoulders. The only fault she could find with him was that he had not gained the good graces of her father. The day slowly waned. Gladys had stolen into her father's room repeatedly to see how he fared, and to her his condition had seemed much about the same. He was, as usual, tired and peevish. But when, at 6 o'clock, she again stole in to peep at him and found him lying back on his pillow, absolutely still and motionless, and without apparently breathing, she was immeasurably shocked. Had he had another fit, or was he dead? Wild with grief and terror, she rushed from the room to telephone the doctor, and met him on the landing.
"You have no need to fear," he said to her the moment he had looked at John Martin. "He is sound asleep, and when he awakes the crisis will be past. To morrow he may go out for a bit, and in a week he will be himself again. Only you must take care that he does not use his brain too much."
Gladys could hardly restrain her delight. She felt pleased with everything and everybody, and her greeting of Shiel some 2 hours later, at the theatre, almost turned his brain. In fact, it was owing to this pleasant surprise that he made 1 or 2 stupid mistakes in his performance, and was sharply pulled back to earth by the ironic laughter of the audience. When the entertainment was over, and he was preparing to accompany Gladys as usual to her motor, the thought of her sparkling eyes and animated features again overcame him. "What shall you advise your father to do?" he asked.
"I think he ought to lose no time in getting a partner," Gladys replied. "Someone who can attend to the business side of the concern for him. It is essential he should not be worried about figures."
"I suppose my services won't be required much longer?" Shiel said, speaking with rather an effort.
"Of course I can't answer for my father," Gladys replied, "but I should imagine he would be only too glad to employ you. The only thing is the salary. You can't live on air, you know, and with the poor attendances he gets now, I don't see how he can afford to pay much."
"I would work for very little," Shiel said. "I should be awfully sorry to give up now. I wonder if you would miss me at all?"
"Of course I should," Gladys retorted. "You have behaved admirably, and I am most grateful to you."
"You needn't be grateful to me. I have never enjoyed anything half so much as I have trying to help you. I am poor penniless, in fact. Since my uncle left me nothing, but supposing I were to get some lucrative post, do you think there would ever be any possibility of "
"Of what?"
"Of your caring for me. I am terribly in love with you."
"I fear I must have given you encouragement," Gladys said. "I'm awfully sorry. You see, I never thought of this, and I don't know what to say to you."
"Won't you give me a chance just a chance?"
"But my father would never hear of it. Unfortunately, he seems to be prejudiced against you. Won't you wait a while, and then, if you are still in the same mind, speak to me again in, say, a year? By that time you will, no doubt, have made some sort of position for yourself."
"And in the meantime you will get engaged to some one else," Shiel exclaimed.
"I don't think I shall," Gladys said. "Of course I meet crowds of men, but you see I am not the marrying sort."
"Do you think you would care for me just a bit?" Shiel asked eagerly.
"A tiny bit, perhaps," Gladys said, "but I'm not at all sure. I can think of no one now but my father, so that if you value my good opinion, or really want to prove your devotion to me, you must, for the time being, devote yourself to him. Who knows, it may lie in your power to do him some service."
"I don't see how," Shiel replied, somewhat despondingly. "But no matter. After you, your father and your father's affairs shall be my first consideration. You will let me see you sometimes, won't you?"
"Sometimes," Gladys laughed. "Good bye. Don't make any mistakes to morrow. Your performance to night was not as good as usual."
And with this somewhat cruel remark, she stepped lightly into her motor and drove off. Shiel now gave way to despair. There were few conditions in life so utterly unenviable as penury and love. To be next door to starving, and at the same time in love. Day after day, Shiel, who was thus afflicted, had revelled in Gladys's company, and had intoxicated himself with her beauty, fully aware that for each moment of pleasure there would later on be a corresponding moment of pain. It was only in romance, he told himself, that the penniless lover suddenly finds himself in a position to marry. In reality, his love suit is rejected with scorn. His adored one marries someone who has, or pretends he has, limitless wealth, and the despised swain ends his days a miserable and dejected bachelor. All the same, Shiel determined that he would for once fare like the hero in romance, that he would either win the object of his affections or perish in the attempt. And no sooner did the fit of the blues, consequent to the conversation last related, wear off, than he set to work in grim earnest to discover some means of breaking up the Modern Sorcery Company Limited, and of restoring to the firm of Martin and Davenport their former prestige. In the meanwhile, affairs were by no means stationary, as far as Hamar and his colleagues were concerned. The appearance of their paper, To morrow, a morning journal that chronicled faithfully every event of the following day, caused a tremendous sensation, and the sale of every other paper sank to nil. No one, naturally, wanting to buy the news that had happened yesterday, when for the same money they could obtain news of what would happen that very day. The stupid method of chronicling past events, Hamar announced in the first issue of his organ, was now obsolete. It was perhaps good enough for the Victorian era, but it was utterly out of keeping with the present age of hourly progress. Who, for instance, wanted to know that at 6 p.m. on the preceding evening there had been a big fire in New York? Was it not far more to the point for them to learn, for example, that at 2 p.m. on that very day Rio de Janeiro would be partially destroyed by an earthquake, that the post office in King's Road, Chelsea, would be broken into by thieves, that Nelson's monument in Trafalgar Square would be blown up by suffragettes, or something equally fresh and exciting? One cannot get thrills, at least not the right kind of thrills, in reading of what has already taken place. To say to ourselves or to a friend, "Just fancy we might have been in that railway accident," or, in reading of a shipwreck, What a mercy we did not embark after all, is it not? Is not half as enthralling as to be wondering if at 11 o'clock that night, when the terrific storm in which 26 people will be killed by lightning in various parts of England, we shall be among the fatal number. One is not much moved to find oneself alive when a danger is past, but one does get terribly excited in contemplating the risk we are bound to run of being killed. Within a week the circulation of To morrow had gone up from 50,000 to 10,000,000. And Hamar, inflated with success, said to himself, "Now I will go and have another look at John Martin." When he arrived, Gladys was in the garden. His stealthy approach had given her no chance to escape. "What is your business?" she asked, glancing nervously in the direction of the house, and dreading lest her father should see Hamar from his window. "I've come to see your father," Hamar said, his eyes resting admiringly on her face and then running leisurely over her figure. "How is the old gentleman?" "He is not well enough to see visitors," Gladys said with absolute hauteur. "Perhaps you will state your business to me." "Well, I don't mind if I do," Hamar replied. "Let us sit down. It's more comfortable than standing," and he dropped into a seat as he spoke. "Now I've been noticing," he went on, "that your show in the Kingsway is not getting on very well, that there are fewer and fewer people there every night, and I've no doubt that it will soon have to dry up altogether. We, on the other hand, are doing better and better every night, and we shall go on doing better. There is no limit to our possibilities. We are worth 500,000 now. Next year we shall be worth 10 times that amount."
"You are optimistical at all events," Gladys said.
"I can afford to be," Hamar grinned. "Now, do you know what we intend doing before very long?"
"I haven't the least idea, and I am not in the slightest degree curious."
"Aren't you? Well, you should be, since it concerns you. We mean to buy up the whole of Kingsway."
"And later on, of course, the whole of Regent Street."
"You are satirical. You are not alarmed at the prospect of having me for a landlord."
"I don't understand you. The hall in Kingsway is my father's own property."
"If that is so, then you have nothing to fear," Hamar laughed. "But I think it just possible you are mistaken. At any rate, I've been in communication with someone styling himself as the landlord."
"My father would have an agreement anyhow," Gladys said.
"Of course," Hamar replied, "and I've a pretty shrewd idea of the terms of it. But enough of this. Let me come to the point. I intend buying the property, and I shall refuse to renew your father's lease unless he agrees to give me what I want."
"Of course, a preposterous price."
"No, you. Only you."
"Me?"
"Yes. I've never seen a girl I like more. I've limitless wealth, and I'll give you everything you want a steam yacht, motors, diamonds, anything, everything. And all I ask in return is that you should consent to be engaged to me on trial say for 15 months, just to see how we get on. What pretty hands you have."
And before Gladys could draw them away, he had caught hold of them in an iron grasp, and, turning them over, cast admiring glances at the slim white fingers with the long almond shaped and carefully manicured nails.
"I reckon," he said, "I shall never find anyone prettier all through. What do you say?"
"Your proposition is impossible, monstrous. I detest you," Gladys retorted, her cheeks white with anger. "Leave go my hands at once, and never let me see you again."
"I can't promise not to see you again," Hamar said, "but I'll let go your hands now, for I'm no more a lover of scenes than you. I anticipated a little fuss at first. It's the way all you women have. You are so modest, you don't like to appear too eager to snap up a good offer. You'll close with it right enough in the end. I'll call again in a few days. By that time you may have changed your mind." And before she could prevent him, he had again seized her hand and was kissing it over and over again. With an ejaculation of the utmost indignation, she sprang away from him, and with all the dignity she could assume, walked to the house. What became of him she did not know. Some few seconds later she told the gardener to see him safely off the premises, but he was nowhere to be found. A week later Hamar turned up again at the cottage, and, despite the vigilance of Gladys and the servants, caught John Martin alone. When the latter at last came to the end of what had at first seemed an inexhaustible stock of invectives, Hamar stated his proposals with mathematical exactitude. "I don't believe for one moment my landlord would be such a blackguard as to play into your hands," John Martin spluttered. "Oh, yes, he would," Hamar replied. "An Englishman will do anything for money, and I am prepared to offer him just twice as much as any one else for your hall. Do you think he will refuse? Not he." "But what on earth's your object? You've ruined me already." "Your daughter!" Hamar cried. "Miss Gladys! I am prepared to go to any lengths to get her. Refuse to give her to me, and I'll turn you out of your hall. I'll torment you with every kind of insect. I'll plague you with disease. I'll make your life hell. But give her to me, and I'll—" "But I won't, and I defy you to do your worst. You—" And there is no knowing what would have happened had not Gladys suddenly come in and dragged her father out of the room. "How dare you!" she exclaimed, returning to the study to find Hamar still there. "I've telephoned to the police, and unless you go instantly, and promise not to come again, I shall give you in charge for annoyance." "Foolish of you, very foolish," Hamar said, "when I want to be friendly. Sooner or later you must give in, so why not end all this needless unpleasantness now and receive me, if not with open arms, at least amicably. You are so awfully pretty. I must have just one—" But before he could kiss Gladys the police arrived, and Hamar once more retired with somewhat undignified haste, and more than a little discomfited. On arriving in Cockspur Street, Hamar's temper underwent a still further trial. Kelson, taking advantage of his absence, had gone off to tea with Lilian Rosenberg. In ill suppressed fury he waited till they returned. "A word with you, Matt," he said, as Kelson tried to shuffle past him. "So this is the way you behave when my back is turned. I suppose you've had a good time?"
"Delightful."
"And you know the consequences?"
"Only that I'm looking forward to the same thing another day."
"She'll go."
"She won't," Kelson chuckled. "She is far too valuable. So there, old man. A month ago your threat might have held good. It won't now. You positively daren't part with her, because if you do so you'd not only part with a good few of your secrets, but you'd part with me."
End of Chapter 16, read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 17 of The Sorcery Club by Elliott O'Donnell. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 17 The Course of True Love. "What's to be done with Matt?" Hamar asked Curtis soon after the interview just recorded. "He's as sweet on Rosensberg as he can be, and says if I dismiss her he'll go too." "Then don't dismiss her," Curtis replied. "Leave them both alone. That's my tip. I don't believe Matt's such a fool as to fall in love, and I'm quite sure the girl isn't. Why, she went to the Tivoli with me 2 nights ago, and to the Empire with another fellow the night before that. It isn't in her to stick to one, and she would go with any one who would treat her. Don't worry your head over that. Matt may say, 'How about Leon and Gladys Martin?' So he might, but there's no danger there. The girl is deuced pretty, splendid eyes, hair, teeth, hands, and all that sort of thing, and I've set my heart on a bit of canoodling with her, but as for love, well, it's not in my programme." "Still stranger things have happened," Curtis said. "Anyhow, I guess you're both mad, and that I'm the only sane one. Give me a 10-course dinner at the Savoy, and you may have all the women in London. I don't go a cent on them." To revert to Kelson. From the hour he had first seen Lilian Rosenberg he had become more and more deeply enamoured. In the hope of meeting her he had hung about the halls and passages of the building, had never missed an opportunity of speaking to her, of feasting himself upon the elfish beauty of her face, of squeezing her hand, and of telling her how much he admired her.
"You really mustn't," she said. "Mr. Hamar has given me strict orders to attend to nothing but my work."
"Oh, damn Hamar," Kelson replied. "If I choose to talk to you, it's no business of his. You've not treated me well. I got you the post, and it is I you should go out with, not Hamar."
and in the quiet nooks and corners, perched on window sill, with one eye kept warily on the guard for fear of interruptions, he told her his history, all about himself from the day of his birth; told her about his parents, his childhood, his school days, his hobbies and cranks, his indiscretions, extravagancies, his carousals, debts, flirtations, with just an excusable amount of exaggeration. He even went so far as to speak of a chronic rheumatism, of a twinge of hereditary gout, and of a slightly hectic cough with which he suddenly remembered he had at one time been troubled.
"Don't you think," Lilian Rosenberg said with mock earnestness, "you are somewhat rash? Have you forgotten that no woman can keep a secret? And you are not telling me one secret, but many. Supposing in a fit of thoughtlessness or absent mindedness I were to divulge them, I should never forgive myself."
"Would it distress you so much?"
"Of course it would. I should be miserable," she laughed,
and Kelson, unable to restrain himself, seized her hands and smothered them with kisses.
"Your fingers would look well covered with rings," he said. "I will give you some, and you shall come with me and choose. Only on no account tell Hamar."
And he kissed her, not on the hands this time, but the lips. Hamar saw him. He watched him from behind the angle of the passage wall, but he said nothing. At least nothing to Kelson. It was to Lilian Rosenberg he spoke.
"It's really not my fault," she said. "I don't encourage him, and if you take my advice you will not interfere, for I am sure at present he means nothing serious. He is the sort of man who imagines himself in love with every one he meets. If you prevent him seeing me, you may actually bring about the result you are most anxious to avoid."
"I'll risk that," Hamar said, "and I absolutely forbid you doing more than merely saying good morning to him. It is either that, or you must go."
"Well, of course I will do as you wish," Lilian said. "I don't care a snap for him, and after all, you ought to know your own business best. It is only natural that you should want him to marry some one who can bring money into the firm."
"I don't want him to marry at all, or anyhow not yet. However, there is no necessity to discuss that point. We have definitely settled the line you are to adopt, and that is all I wanted to speak to you about. When next you feel inclined to flirt, come to me and you shall have kisses as well as rings." It was shortly after this tête à tête that Lilian Rosenberg was interrupted in her work by a rap at the door.
"Come in," she said, and a young man entered.
"I believe a clerk is wanted here," he explained. "I've come to apply for the situation. Can I see Mr. Hamar?"
"I'm afraid he is out. There's no one in at present," Lilian Rosenberg replied, eyeing the stranger critically. "If you like to wait a while, you may do so. Sit down."
She signalled to him to take a chair, and went on typing. For some minutes the silence was unbroken, save for the tapping of fingers and the clicking of the machine. Then she looked up, and their eyes met. "It is not pleasant to be out of work," he said. "Have you ever experienced it?"
"Once or twice," she said, "and I never wish to again. You don't look as if you were much used to office work."
"No. I'm an artist, but times are hard with us. The present Government has driven all the money out of the country, and no one buys pictures now. So I'm forced to turn my hand to something else."
"I love pictures. My father was an artist."
"Then we have something in common," the young man said. "Would you like to see my work? I love showing it to people who understand something about painting and are not afraid to criticize."
"I should like to see it immensely, though I don't presume to criticize."
"May I inquire your name?" the young man asked eagerly. "Mine is Shiel Davenport."
"And mine Lilian Rosenberg,"
the girl said with a smile. "If I don't get the post, may I write to you sometimes, Miss Rosenberg, and ask you to my studio? I call it a studio, though it's really only an attic." Lilian Rosenberg nodded.
"I shall be delighted to come," she said. "I am afraid I am very unconventional."
There was no time for further conversation, as Hamar entered the room at that moment.
"What do you want?"
he asked curtly. Shiel told him.
"You're too late," Hamar said. "I've engaged some one. If you'd called earlier there might have been some chance for you, as you look tolerably intelligent. But it's no use now, so be off."
As Shiel left the room he caught Lilian Rosenberg looking at him, and he saw that her eyes were full of sympathy. The acquaintance, thus begun, ripened.
She went to see his pictures, they had tea together, and they spent many subsequent hours in each other's company. And though Shiel saw in Lilian Rosenberg only a rather prepossessing girl from whom, after cultivating her acquaintance, he was hoping to learn the inner working of the Modern Sorcery Company Limited, with her it was different. In Shiel, Lilian Rosenberg saw the qualities she had always been seeking, the qualities she had most despaired of ever finding, and which she had so often declared existed only in fiction. He only interested her, she argued, but she forgot that interest, as well as pity, is akin to love, and that where the former leads, the latter almost invariably follows.
"I don't believe you have enough to eat," she said to him one day. "You are a perfect shadow. How do you exist if you have no private means?"
"I just manage to exist, and that is all." Shiel laughed, and he spoke the truth. His present state of semi starvation having resulted from the untoward events which had happened prior to his application for the post of clerk to the Modern Sorcery Company Limited, and his subsequent acquaintance with Lilian Rosenberg. Whilst John Martin had been ill, and he had helped at the Hall in Kingsway, he had lived well. Gladys had taken care he was paid, not a big sum to be sure, but enough to keep him. But directly John Martin, in spite of Gladys's remonstrances, had resumed work, Shiel had been dismissed.
"I wish I could help you," John Martin said to him,
"for I really feel grateful to you for all you have done. But to tell you the candid truth, I can't afford to pay any salaries. As you know, the receipts of the Hall are next to nothing, but the expenses continue just the same rent, gas, and staff, all heavy items. Moreover, at your uncle's death, many of his creditors put claims on the firm for debts he had incurred without either my sanction or knowledge, and it has been a serious drain on me to pay them off. In fact, my finances are now at such a low ebb that I cannot possibly do anything for you. If only the Modern Sorcery Company could be cleared off the scenes."
"You would, I suppose, feel extremely grateful to whoever cleared them off."
"I would,"
John Martin replied, with a significant chuckle. "Even though it were someone who had not stood very high in your estimation?"
"Even though it were the devil."
"Now look here, Mr. Martin," Shiel said, trying to appear calm. "I will devote all my energies and all my time to your cause the overthrow of the Modern Sorcery Company if only in the event of my being successful, you will give me some hope of being permitted to win your daughter."
"I promise you that hope, and any other you may see fit to aspire to," John Martin said with a grim smile, "since there isn't the remotest chance of your succeeding in the task you have set yourself. Believe me, it will take both money and wits to get the better of Hamar, Curtis, and Kelson."
"Anyhow, I have your permission to try. I shall do my best."
"You may do what you like," John Martin rejoined, "so long as you don't talk to me about Gladys till you've redeemed your pledge. That is to say, till you've overthrown the Modern Sorcery Company. In the meanwhile, I must ask you to abstain from seeing her."
"I'm afraid I can't promise that."
"Can't promise that!"
John Martin cried, his eyes suffusing with sudden passion.
"Can't you? Then, damn it, you must. I'm not going to have my daughter throw herself away on a penniless puppy. There, curse it all, you know what I think of you now. You are a bumptious puppy, and I swear you shall not come within a mile of her."
"I shall," Shiel retorted, drawing himself up to his full height. "I shall see her whenever she will permit me, and since she is not at home at the present moment, I shall now await her return outside the house, and defy the savage old bull dog inside it." Leaving John Martin too taken aback with astonishment to articulate a syllable, Shiel withdrew. True to his word, he waited to see Gladys. He paced up and down the road in front of the house from 11 o'clock in the morning, when his interview with John Martin had terminated, till 8 o'clock in the evening, and was just beginning to think he would have to give up all hope of seeing her that day, when she came in sight.
"Really!" she exclaimed, after Shiel had explained the situation. "Do you mean to say you have stayed here all day?"
"Of course I have," Shiel answered. "I told your father I would see you, and I meant to stay here till I did."
"And what good has it done you?"
"All the good in the world. I shall sleep twice as well for it. I'm more in love with you than you think, and I mean to marry you one day. My prospects at present are absolutely Thames Embankmentish, but no matter. I've hit upon a capital way of ferreting out the secrets of the Modern Sorcery Company. I shall get employed by them," and he told Gladys of the advertisement he had seen in the paper.
"Well, I wish you all success," she said, "but I'm afraid you've upset my father dreadfully, and the doctor says excitement is the very worst thing for him, and may lead to another stroke. You must on no account come here again until I give you leave."
"But may I see you elsewhere?"
"If you're a wise man, you'll do one thing at a time. You'll discover the secret of the Sorcery Company first, and then "
"When I have discovered it?"
"My father may forgive you. Have I told you I'm going on the stage? I know Bromley Burnham, and he's offered me a part at the Imperial. It is imperative now that I should do something to help my father."
"If you become an actress," Shiel said bitterly, "my chances of marrying you will be indeed small."
"Not smaller than they are now," Gladys observed. "Au revoir."
And with one of those tantalising and perplexing smiles with which some women, consciously or unconsciously, counteract, and sometimes perhaps for reasons best known to themselves, completely nullify the needless severity of their speech, shook hands with Shiel and left him. Chapter 17. By Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 18 of The Sorcery Club by Elliott O'Donnell. This recording is in the public domain. By Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 18. Stage 3. The weeks sped by. Gladys Martin went on the stage, and thanks to beauty and influence, rather than to talent, though in the latter respect she was certainly not wanting, she became an immediate success. Her photos, some taken alone, and some with Bromley Burnham, occupied a conspicuous place in all the weekly illustrateds, and in innumerable shop windows. People talked of her as they do of all actresses. Some said her father was a broken down peer, some a needy parson, and some a policeman. Some said the Duke of Warminster was madly in love with her, others that Seton Smythe, the notorious Cabinet Minister, was pining for a divorce on her behalf, and others that she was seldom seen off the stage. She was entertaining the King and the Belgians.
"I've met her,"
Lilian Rosenberg said to Shiel, as they stopped one evening to gaze at Gladys's portraits outside the Imperial Theatre.
"She came to our place to have a dream interpreted, and I thought nothing of her. I don't admire her the least bit in the world. Do you?"
"I do," Shiel replied, rather sharply.
"Why, you sound quite angry," Lilian Rosenberg laughed. "One would think you knew her. I wonder if Bromley Burnham is very much in love with her. He looks as if he were in those photographs. Do you think it possible for a man and woman to make love to each other every night on the stage like they do, without one or the other of them being affected?"
"I really couldn't say," Shiel replied. "I'm no authority on such matters. They don't interest me in the least." But this was an untruth. They did interest him, and very much too. He seldom indeed thought of anything else. Had Gladys fallen in love with Bromley Burnham? Could she resist the fascinations of so handsome a man? He did not, of course, pay any heed to the gossip that coupled her name with dukes and other notorieties. He knew Gladys too well for that. But when he saw her thus photographed, clasped in the arms of Bromley Burnham, he had grave apprehensions. He longed to see her, to ask her if she were still free, but his every attempt failed. She always avoided him, and there was no other alternative save to further his scheme for crushing the Sorcery Company, and to hope for the best. And then these dark days of his life, when he was tormented by the yellow demon of jealousy, and at the same time endured hunger, Lilian Rosenberg was his solacing angel. Utterly regardless of appearances she did not exaggerate when she said, "I am not conventional. I don't care twopence for Mrs. Grundy." She visited him in his garret, and she seldom went empty handed. "I don't want your things," he rudely expostulated, when she loaded his table with cold chicken, jellies and potted meats. "I'm not starving." "Yes, you are," she said, "and you've got to eat all I bring you." And she made him eat. She made him, too, go for walks with her, and she insisted that he should go with her on Saturday afternoons for long rambles in the country, knowing all the time that Kelson was eating his heart out for love of her, and prophesying all kinds of terrible happenings to himself, unless she returned his affections. Up to this point, at all events, Shiel did not allow his friendship with Lilian to blind him to the fact that he was cultivating her acquaintance with a set object. He frequently sounded her to see how much she knew of the inner workings of the Firm, and he satisfied himself that she knew very little.
"They never discuss their powers in my presence," she told him, "but I see them do very queer things. Mr. Kelson seldom walks to his room. He flies. He takes a little jump into the air, moves his arms and legs as if he were swimming, and flies upstairs along the corridor. And what do you think happened the other day? Some men were carrying into the building a huge oak chest and several large pictures that Mr. Hamar had bought on sale, when Mr. Kelson arrived on the scene. 'There is no need to lift these things,' he said to the men. 'Put them down.' He then made some rapid signs in the air and muttered something, whereupon the chest and pictures rose in the air and followed him into the building and up the stairs to their respective quarters." "Surprised!" Lilian Rosenberg ejaculated. "They were simply bowled over, and looked at one another with such idiotic expressions in their bulging eyes and gaping mouths that I nearly died with laughter."
"And you've no idea how Kelson did that trick?"
"None, excepting, of course, that the signs he made, and what he said, must have something to do with it."
It was on the tip of Shiel's tongue to ask her if she would try and find out for him, but he checked himself. Even at this juncture of their friendship he dare not appear too curious. He must wait. To go back to Hamar, he had seen Gladys act. He had become more infatuated with her than ever, and his passion was stimulated by the knowledge that she was universally admired, and that half the men in London were dying to be introduced to her.
"Money will do anything,"
one of Hamar's friends, they were all Jews, remarked to him.
"Offer the manager of the Imperial £100 and he'll do anything you like with regard to the girl. Every manager can be bought and every actress too."
The suggestion was a welcome one, and Hamar acted on it. But whether or not the exception proves the rule, he was immeasurably disconcerted to find that, with regard to money and managers, his friend had deceived him. Far from being pleased at the offer of a bribe, the manager of the Imperial, an old Harrovian, raised his foot, and Hamar, who invariably paled at the prospect of violence, hurriedly withdrew. On the eve of the initiation into Stage 3, the trio were very much perturbed. "I hope to goodness nothing will appear to me," Kelson said. "My heart isn't strong enough to stand the shock of seeing striped figures. They should come to you, Curtis. A few jumps wouldn't do you any harm. You're fat enough." Agreeing each to sleep with a light in his room, they separated, and about 2 o'clock Curtis, who had been suffering of late from his liver, the effect, so the doctor told him, of living a little too well, and could not sleep, heard a knock at his door. To his astonishment it was Kelson in his pyjamas.
"Hullo!" Curtis exclaimed. "What on earth brings you here, and however did you come?"
"The usual way," Kelson said,
in what struck Curtis as rather unusual tones.
"I flew here to tell you that we are now in Stage 3. Give me paper and ink. I want to write down the instructions I have received."
Curtis conducted him into his sitting room, switched on the lights and, giving him what he wanted, poured out a couple of tumblers of soda and milk.
"This will lower my temperature," he said to himself. "I shall know if I'm dreaming."
Then he sat by Kelson's side and observed what he wrote.
"The properties of walking on the water, and of breathing under the water, are conferred on you during the forthcoming stage. You must refrain from red flesh and alcohol, but may eat poultry, fish, fruit and vegetables in abundance."
"The devil I may!" Curtis said in a fury.
"How very kind. I would rather have roast beef than all the poulets and kippers in Christendom." Without noticing his interruption, Kelson went on writing.
"You must also concentrate for 1 hour every morning. Grade 2 in the scale of concentration, though sufficient for projection through ether, will not enable you to offer sufficient resistance to the pressure of water. You must reach grade 3 on the scale of concentration before you can either walk on or breathe under the water. From 6 to 7 a.m.
you must fix your eyes on a glass of fresh spring water, and concentrate your very hardest on amalgamating with it, on passing your immaterial ego into it. At night, before going to bed, you must drink a mixture composed of 2 drachms of Vindru Sokum, 1 drachm of Harnoon Obi, and 1 ounce of distilled water. Vindru Sokum and Harnoon Obi are a species of seaweed, the former of a pale salmon colour, the latter of a deep blue. They were formerly shrubs grown in the wood of Endlmoker in Atlantis, and are now to be found at a depth of 200 fathoms, 20 miles to the northeast of Achill Island. These weeds must be well rinsed first, and when the prescribed amount of each has been carefully cut off and weighed, it must be boiled in distilled water, and the compound thus formed allowed to cool before being drunk. This mixture renders the lungs immune to the action of fluid, and will enable you to breathe as easily in water as in air. There is still, however, the action of gravity to be considered, and this must be counteracted by sound. Before experimenting, these Atlantean words must be repeated aloud in the following order: Karma, Nardka, Rapto, Numen. Karma, Hula, Piscuste.
"It's all very well to write these directions," Curtis said, "but how am I to obtain the weeds? I can't go fish for them."
"You must engage the services of Mr. John Whaley, formerly employed by the Brazilian Government in repairing marine cables. He will do all you want for the sum of £200.
Kelson left off writing, and, wishing Curtis good night, walked out of the room. "You'll be deuced cold without an overcoat," Curtis called out after him. "Won't you have mine?"
But there was no reply, and though Curtis strained his ears to listen, he could catch no sound of a vehicle. Kelson left Curtis at 20 minutes past 2. At 2:30, Hamar, who had been sound asleep, was awakened by a loud rap.
"Kelson," he gasped, "how on earth did you get here? Are you a projection?"
"Don't worry me with questions," Kelson replied. "I come to give you instructions. A paper and ink, quick." Hamar obeyed with alacrity. "On you," Kelson wrote, "is conferred the property of invisibility, a property common in Atlantis, and still possessed by the Fakirs of Hindustan, the natives of Easter Island, and certain tribes in New Guinea. You must reach grade 3 in the scale of concentration by concentrating from 5 to 6 o'clock every morning on amalgamating yourself with the ether. You must sit with your head thrown back, gazing up into space, allowing nothing to distract your mind. Wholly and solely your thoughts must be fixed on the ether. This property of invisibility can only be successfully practised when the 3rd grade in the scale of concentration has been reached. Carry out these instructions, and in a week's time you will then be able to experiment, to become invisible at will. But before experimenting it will always be necessary to repeat the words Bakra, Naka, Taxomana, and to swallow a pill composed of 2 drachms of Derhens Voskry, 1 drachm of Karkavoli, and 1 drachm of saffron. Derhens Voskry and Karkavoli are a crimson and white species of seaweed that grows on the 100-fathom level 30 miles west-southwest of the Aran Islands, Galway Bay. Mr. John Whaley, employed by the Brazilian Government for repairing cables, will procure these ingredients for you. To become visible, you've only to repeat the words Bakra, Naka, Taxomana backwards."
"But how about my clothes?" Hamar asked. "Will they disappear too?"
"Everything," Kelson answered. "Hat, boots, tie, and breeches. All you have on. Good night." And walking out of the room, he leaped into the air and flew downstairs. But though Hamar listened attentively, he could not hear him leave the building. There was no sound of any door. When they met the following midday in Cockspur Street, Kelson remembered nothing of his visits. "All I know is," he said, "that the moment I got into bed I fell asleep, and suddenly found myself standing in a kind of brown desert, talking to a tall man with most peculiar features and eyes, and a dazzling white skin. He informed me he had been an animal trainer in the state of Balankan, Atlantis, and was ordered to give me instructions as to the taming of the present day wild beast. 'You must obtain a stone called the Red Laryx,' he said. It is to be found in great quantities on the 300 fathom level 40 miles to the west-southwest of North Arran Island, and can be procured for you by the same man that gets the weeds for Hamar and Curtis. It is a blood red pebble, covered with particularly vivid green spots, and cannot be mistaken. Sit with it pressed against your forehead for an hour every morning, and concentrate hard on amalgamating yourself with it, that is, passing into it, and its properties will gradually be imparted to you. Do this regularly for a week, and by the end of that time you will be able to experiment with animals. All you will have to do will be to hold the stone slightly clenched in your left hand, whilst with your right you make these signs in the air," and he showed me certain passes. "Stare fixedly into the animal's eyes all the while, and by the time you have finished making the passes you will find the animals are subdued. Pronounce these words, Metarakavakana, holding up as you do so your right hand with the thumb turned down and held right across the palm, and the little finger stretched out as wide as it will go, and you will understand what any animal wishes to say." He ceased speaking, and approaching close to me, tapped my forehead, whereupon there was a blank, and on recovering consciousness I found myself in bed, feeling somewhat exhausted and very cold.
"You have no recollection of coming to see us in your pyjamas about 2 o'clock in the morning?" Hamar asked.
"Don't talk rot," Kelson said. "I'm in no mood for fooling. I've got a chill on my liver."
"What was it, Leon?" Curtis inquired.
"A case of unconscious projection," Hamar said. "Clearly the work of the Unknown. We must commence carrying out the instructions at once."
At the end of a week, Hamar, Kelson and Curtis began to put in practice their newly acquired properties. Hamar tested his in a first class railway carriage on the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway.
"I'll go for a day's trip to Brighton," he said, "and cheat the company. They deserve it."
He went to Victoria, and ignoring the booking office, calmly seated himself in a first class compartment, where amongst other occupants sat a quite remarkably proper looking clergyman and a very handsomely dressed lady with a haughty stare and a typical nouveau riche nose. When the ticket collector came round before the train started, Hamar waited till everyone else in the compartment had shown him their tickets, and then just as the man was about to demand his, swallowed one of the prescribed pills, repeating immediately in a loud voice, which caused considerable excitement among the other passengers, the words "Bakra Naka Taksomana." The next moment he had disappeared. "Strike me red!" the collector gasped, putting one hand to his heart and grasping at the door with the other. "What's become of him? Was he a ghost?"
"I don't know what to make of it," the parson said, heroically preserving his Oxford drawl in despite of his chattering teeth. "I don't, of course, believe in ghosts. He must have been an evil spirit. Dear me! Ah! Help me out of the carriage at once," the lady with the stare panted. "I consider the whole thing most disgraceful. I shall report it to the company." "What's the matter, Joe?" an inspector called out, threading his way through the crowd of people that had commenced to collect at the door of the compartment.
"I'm blessed if I know," the collector said. "The honly explanation I can give is that a gent who was seated here has dissolved. The hot weather has melted him like butter."
At this there was a shout of laughter. The inspector slammed the door, the guard whistled, and the next moment the train was off. As soon as the train was well out of the station, Hamar repeated the words he had used, backwards, and he was once again visible. The effect of his reappearance amongst them was even more striking than of his previous disappearance.
"Take it away! Take it away!" the lady opposite him shouted, throwing up her hands to ward him off. "It's there again! Take it away! I shall die! I shall go mad!"
"How hideous! How diabolical!" a stout elderly man said in slow measured tones, as if he were reading his own funeral service. "It must be the devil! The devil! Ha!" And burying his face in his hands, he indulged in a loud fit of mirthless laughter.
"Why don't you do something? Talk theology to it. Exercise it,"
a remarkably plain woman in the far corner of the carriage said, in highly indignant tones, to the clergyman.
"As usual.
Whenever there is something to be done, it is a woman who must do it."
She got up, and casting a look of infinite scorn at the clergyman, whose condition of terror prevented him uttering even the one telling, biting word, "Suffragette," that had risen and stuck in his throat, raised her umbrella, and before Hamar could stop her, struck it vigorously at him.
"Ghost! Demon! Devil!" she cried. "I know no fear. Begone!"
And the point of her umbrella coming in violent contact with Hamar's waistcoat, all the breath was unceremoniously knocked out of him, and with a ghastly groan he rolled off his seat on to the floor, where he writhed and grovelled in the most dreadful agony, whilst his assailant continued to stab and jab at him. In all